Welcome to episode 20 of the Side Letters podcast, a weekly B2B insights on film, tech, and future business in Europe, made for professionals and decision makers in the creative economy such as you. The Side Letters is a conversation between us, three European producers, and our guests, exploring what's going on in the markets. And we share our individual perspectives on that. It's June 17, and we've got a couple of things to talk about. Today, we have a great conversation lined up for you. We sat down with Johanna Koljonen, a media analyst, author, and the person behind the Nostradamus Report, which just released its 2026 edition. It's called Challenging Projections, and its central argument is that film, TV, streaming, and the creator economy are no longer separate worlds. They are one connected ecosystem, and more on that very soon later in the show. Plus, two stories from this week that really moved us, and they're really both circling the same question: who gets to shape the future of the creative industries, and where does Europe fit in? So all of this is about what matters for the creative industries in Europe. I'm Fabian Massa, producer working in Berlin and Hamburg, and for the intro, you're flying with me. You'll hear both Johanna and Jennifer later in this episode in the interview with Johanna Koljonen. So let's start with something that genuinely gave me some chills this week. On June 11th, a group of European researchers and investors, Dan Juin, Judith Dada, and several colleagues, published a report called Europe 2031, What Getting AI Wrong Means for Us. The link is in the show notes, and I can highly recommend all of you to read it in full. Now, what makes this different from the usual policy paper is the format, and I find this very interesting. They wrote it as a story. It follows two fictional characters, Caroline, a young policy officer at the European Commission, and Christian, a European tech founder who moved to San Francisco. And through their eyes, their text messages, their frustrations, their conversations over drinks, the report traces what could happen to Europe between now and 2031 if we don't get our AI strategy right. And the authors are clear that they believe in Europe. They wrote this because they think the trajectory can still be changed. But the scenario they paint is sobering. A Europe that ends up economically sidelined, politically weakened, and dependent on AI system it doesn't control. And because it's told as a story rather than a policy framework, it hits differently. It really sticks, which I think is itself worth noting for those of us in the creative industries, because storytelling changes minds in ways that data alone doesn't. And that's all what we know. And the Europe 2031 team clearly knows that as well. So why does this matter for our world specifically? I found three angles. First, digital sovereignty. That's also what we often talk about in this podcast. So the report is fundamentally about dependency on American infrastructure, AI models, American platforms. And for creative businesses, that dependency is very real. Where our films get discovered, how content gets recommended, what audiences AI tools are trained to surface, all of that is shaped by systems we don't own and don't control. Second, competitiveness. The report makes a strong case in the productivity gap between US and European companies, and that it will keep widening if Europe can't access and deploy frontier AI on equal terms. Think about what that means for production companies, for distributors, for anyone building a creative business that has to compete internationally. And the third one is the storytelling angle that goes both ways. So this is the core of our industry, and we can contribute to the narrative to convince and to inspire action. The side letters exist because we believe Europe's creative industries have a unique voice, but the infrastructure, the tools, the platforms, the algorithm, it is all entirely built elsewhere and calibrated for someone else's priorities. That voice gets harder to project, and that's a real and urgent problem. Now, here's where the week got really interesting. The Europe 2031 report came out on June 11th. And 2 days later, on Friday the 13th, and yes, the timing is almost 2 on the nose, something happened that could have come straight out of its pages. Anthropic, the American AI company behind the Claude models, was ordered by the US government to immediately disable access to its two most powerful models, Fable 5 and Mythos 5, for all foreign nationals, globally including European users, including Anthropic's own non-US employees. For those of you who are using Claude, you might have seen the note inside the app that these models are blocked. So the reason cited was national security, a suspected vulnerability in Fable 5. According to Anthropic's public statement, they received the directive at 5:21 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, with barely any explanation, and they had no choice but to comply, just like that, switched off for everyone outside the US. And the European Commission reacted almost immediately. Their spokesperson called it a wake-up call and said the Commission is examining the implications for EU digital policy, because here's the point. This is exactly what Europe 2031 warns about. Not in 2029, not in some speculative future. It's June 2026. And the US government can, overnight, with just a letter, suspend access to tools that European companies are increasingly building their workflows around. And even we do that. And Europe currently has very little leverage in that situation. That's the dependency problem made visible in real time. So for us in the creative industries, this is worth sitting with. AI tools are increasingly part of production pipelines, of development, of localization, marketing, audience research. And when those tools can be turned off with a single government directive, that's a real operational risk. And our industry needs to be part of the policy conversation happening right now about European AI strategy and not watching it from the sidelines. In fact, we can contribute with our power of storytelling about reaching people to inspire action and to inspire change. So the link to the Europe 2031 paper is in the show notes. Seriously, one of the most important reads of the year, if not for the next years, I believe. Now let's go to the second story, and this is a little bit more upbeat. Variety reported that CAA, one of the most powerful agencies in Hollywood, and TPG, that's a major US private equity firm, have launched a $250 million holding company called Compound Creative Holdings, and its purpose is to acquire, to invest in, and to grow creator economy businesses. YouTubers, podcasters, online media entrepreneurs. I'm not sure if the side letters would be an investment case for them, but anyway, you know what I'm talking about. So the CAA's co-chairman, Kevin Huvane, put it plainly. He said creators are now, quote unquote, building full-fledged media companies with direct audience connections and true ownership of their intellectual property. So this is not a side bet, it's $250 million with a dedicated managing partner and a full executive structure. And what strikes me here is what this signals about convergence. The traditional entertainment industry is no longer watching the creator economy from a distance. They're buying in at scale. And this maps almost perfectly onto what Johanna Koljonen writes in the 2026 Nostradamus Report, that film, TV, streaming, and creator media are now one ecosystem and not four separate lanes. CAA and TPG are just putting their money where that thesis is. So for European professionals, producers, distributors, sales agents, talent representatives, this is really a signal worth paying attention to. And the capital is flowing. And if your company, your endeavor, or your strategy still treats the creator space as something separate from, quote unquote, the real industry, I believe that gap is closing fast. So this brings us perfectly to our guest today. Johanna Koljonen has been tracking and forecasting the screen industry for over a decade, and she is the author of the Nostradamus Report, commissioned annually by the Göteborg Film Festival, now in its 13th year. And the 2026 edition, Challenging Projections, was launched at the Marché du Film in Cannes last month. And the report maps the audiovisual landscape as one connected ecosystem and asks a sharp question at its center. Whose definitions of value and success are shaping the art, the business, and the ambitions of this industry right now? We really had a good conversation, and I think you find it genuinely useful, especially alongside everything we just discussed. Here's our conversation with Johanna Koljonen.
Hello, Johanna Koljonen, our wonderful guest today. A futurist, a media analyst, and the person who is behind one publication that every industry professional should read. If they only read one thing, it should be Nostradamus Report. Johanna, welcome to the Side Letters.
Thank you very much. it's always a little bit overwhelming with that kind of introduction. I'm like, I'm not sure, but like, I guess I wouldn't say near future futurist. We don't look very far.
It was a very humble introduction for everything you do. Johanna, let's start with Nostradamus Report and how did it start and how did you get to be the editor of it?
I had done some work with the Nordic film market, with the industry programming, maybe like some moderating some panels and things like that. I was a film critic when I was younger. And at that point, I think I had already largely given it up because of like the media landscape was changing under me. And CAA Edström, who was head of industry then, had this insight that to make meaningful industry content for the festival and the market, we needed to have some like a better grasp of all of the changes that were like really starting to accelerate there about, like almost 15 years ago now. And the original idea was for me to spend some time looking at that so that we could make better content. But very rapidly we realized, and she realized, because this is largely her idea to begin with, was that the best thing we could offer the industry was just somebody who has time to look at what's happening. Because obviously, if you're a producer, for instance, like many of the people who come to the market, you don't have time to do anything extra. And we thought, like, how big can this change be? How long can that go? and back then I was like an intelligent outsider. I think that was my unique selling point then. I could speak to people in the industry and I could ask dumb questions, or like I didn't take for granted that things had to be a certain way. That was good. Now, of course, I've been doing this so long, I don't even know, is this the 13th report or something like that? Now, of course, I am actually an expert in a lot of this stuff. So now I have another position that's useful, which is that it's my job to think about this on a systems level. And of course, again, if you work operatively anywhere in the value chain, you have to be a specialist in your thing. And this is such an insanely complex industry. That's why we're having all these problems with the policies as well. Like, we can't get our policymakers on, like, it's so difficult to understand. It's so difficult to explain what we're doing and what our problems are. So, but it has been a joy to get to think about these complex systems for this long.
It's great to have you really in the industry to give all of us this outsider perspective, even if you're on the inside. But maybe you can tell us, before we jump into this year's edition of Nostradamus Report, can you maybe tell us still a little bit about the methodology? Because with every report, you are interviewing different people, you're looking at slightly different topics. So how does that work?
Yeah, so essentially, it's some people say a little bit dismissively, oh, it's a journalistic product. I used to be a journalist. I don't think there's anything wrong with making a journalistic product. We are following what's happening in the industry. I'm reading a lot. I'm reading a lot of just like publicly available information and some analysis that you pay for as well, listening to a lot of talks at conferences and so on. My colleagues at Göteborg, of course, speak to so many people in the industry during the year, and also a lot of these kind of off-the-record or sort of green room conversations also feed into our understanding. We have access to these perspectives, the kinds of things that are difficult for different reasons to say on the record. People can talk about in informal ways, and that does also shape our thinking. And and then we look at the available data, but of course, as I also write about a little bit this year, that always, you get the good data with the delay. The best data is always like 2 years old, and that's actually a very long time in this industry. So these very subjective and very like experiential perspectives of what people who are in the midst of it are thinking and seeing right now, I find incredibly valuable as sources of information. And every year we interview, like 7 to 10 people who are in strategic positions or are sort of working in these future-oriented ways. And I always say that this is a party trick. Of course, we're not predicting the future. We're describing what people are doing right now and what they're thinking about right now. And just because the cycles are so long with making feature films or things like that, the things they are concerned with today in strategic positions in the industry is everybody's reality in a couple of years. But our horizon is 3 to 5 years. Yeah.
Hi, Johanna. Thanks also from my side for joining us here. Really great. I really enjoyed reading the Nostradamus Report this year. It's also quite entertaining, actually, to read it, because the way you mix the interviews and quotes with hard numbers that are hard to find, as you say, gives an interesting scope. And of course, if you say you cannot predict the future, at least we get an idea about what the near future can be. What you also do is create some new terms that you fill with meaning. And I want to tap into that. For example, you mentioned the connected ecosystem. I mean, of course, everybody has a perception what that can be, but what does it mean in particular in this year's report?
Well, in this year's report, I'm going to step back a little bit and say that the reports can be quite different year to year, depending on what kinds of things are happening and what we feel is needed. Like if you were a reader like 4 or 5 years ago, I think a lot of that was, and especially sort of in the pre-pandemic time, it would have been like this kind of deep dive chapters on different topics that it made sense to be updated about just then. But we've always had these kind of macro societal perspectives and like systems perspectives, things about talking about politics, talking about, for instance, political polarization in Europe. I remember 10 years ago in Cannes, I was talking about this and people were like, why? Lady, why is she talking about this? Like, we just want to know about business stuff. But of course, again, if almost all of our films and a huge chunk of our television programs is publicly funded, it really matters what is happening politically in Europe. But these were the kinds of things. We have been a very insular industry. But I think our insularity was broken in the pandemic, essentially. It became so undeniably clear that we are part of the world and that the sort of practical things of the world affect us. Last year's report was called Reality Resistance, and it was looking at a lot of these kind of political and world type issues. And I think that this year's report is a little bit of a companion piece to that, or I've realized after the fact that that's what it is, even though we're looking now at like industry internal systems. So I've been saying for many years, it's felt important to say that, film and TV and streaming are one industry now. And that's true. I mean, they are. And to say that they are now like the traditional industry. And then we have all this online stuff, which is like the new addition, which also increasingly is the same industry. Or all of these businesses are kind of part of the same sector. It's the same labor market. We're using the same platforms. To the audiences, there's no big difference and so on. But what I've also realized is that while true, that's not like the full story. And it's very helpful to also think about it like in these different projections. We're using this map metaphor a lot this year. Because you can also say that film is a lot of very different industries. Like the sort of film industry of theatrical exhibition, which is also hospitality industry and a real estate industry, that's a very different type of business than art house, the global art house ecosystem, or the kinds of things that like a Hollywood studio would be making. And with all of that's the film industry. Yeah, but it's not very helpful. They are in this ecosystem relationship with each other, but it's not very helpful to know the kinds of things we need to understand now require us to think about this with more nuance. And historically, we didn't have to because our value chain was so static. Like it used to shift maybe every 20 years or something like that. Now we have VHS, or now we have something like that. Something in cable television changes something. And now, of course, we have a more nuanced understanding of all of these sub-businesses and how they operate. And then around that, the other big insight is, oh my God, of course, there was always a huge media ecosystem around our value chain. There was so much labor and passion and investment and communication that we relied on fully, input and output into our value chain. Every step of our content production value chain, of our distribution, of course, of our communication and so on, of the legacy of our work, is relying on other media. And I think that one answer to, because a lot of us have had the experience the last 10 years, so I am doing everything right. I'm doing everything right. This is a foolproof project. It turned out great. Why isn't it working? What am I doing wrong? And the answer is you're not doing anything wrong. It's just that you're assuming, the only thing you're doing wrong is that you're assuming that around you is still this huge scaffolding of this other ecosystem, all of these other media, linear television, newspaper, magazines, fanzines, cosplay, merchandise, all of the things that have carried us and that have been our source of input and our source of talent and all of our platforms of communication. And all of those other media have changed or disappeared. And we have forgotten to take that into account. So if two of the legs of the table are missing, of course it's not going to work. Some things are going to fall over. And I feel very stupid for having taken 15 years to realizing this. I mean, I have written about this many years in the report, kind of in passing, but I have never stopped to think about what it actually means.
Yeah, I had a question, but I would maybe start by what's left. But the main idea behind the report is that there is a creator-led content economy, which changes the roles of those professionals, those studios, the broadcasters. So in what way do they change their roles and what's left?
Yeah. So So there are like at least two different answers to that. And also maybe I tell the story of how I thought of this. I was listening in Göteborg this year to a panel, a fascinating panel at TV Drama Vision, at the TV Drama Vision conference, where this incredibly smart woman called Victoria Fay, who is sort of running the analysis department, the lab at IPR.VC. She was talking about the new content economy. And this is like a model that they developed to be able, I think, originally just to understand the finances and to be able to think about like, how do you analyze like creator businesses? They're an investment company, right? How do you analyze it for the purposes of like investing money, institutional capital into these businesses? And what they sort of arrived at is that if you think in the abstract about how this works, and careers. So it can be an individual creator, it can be a YouTube channel, or it can be a film, or it can be a TV show or something like that. If you just think about this in the abstract, you can kind of simplify them to IP brands. And then what is the kind of economic model by which IP brands thrive today? And they kind of identified it in the overlap between what the creator economy, which is essentially having a direct to consumer relationship, and what they call the experience economy, which of course means something specific also in other contexts, but they have a very sort of broad application where it's all experiences, everything that happens in the physical space, but also merchandising. So for instance, everything that exists in the physical world. And their idea is that you have to have like a direct consumer relationship. You have to have really high quality thing, whatever it is the IP brand is, that has to be very good. You have to have like an audience and community-centric approach. And you have to have a diversified business model with these kind of digital and experiential parts. And I thought this is very smart. She was calling it the new content economy. And then the more I thought about it, the more this is how everything works right now. Like anything that works, the New York Times works like this. That's what they are now. They are an IP brand that operates in this way. Every stand-up comedian's career works like this. And then when we combine this insight, or like for A24 is a distributor, you can start this at different ends, right? You can start as a creator, and then you work up towards a kind of business-to-business level, where you, for instance, can become a content provider for Amazon or something like that. Or you can start as a traditional, what we would consider like a traditional film industry company, and you expand in the other direction towards a direct consumer relationship. So I was talking this week to a guy who runs a major film studio in Europe, who also has an experiential business now, for instance. So they are starting a direct-to-consumer relationship in that way. I'm like, hang on, like now we're on to something. And in the report, they also write about how many of these elements have these long, like ancient histories, century-old history in some cases inside our industry. None of these parts are new. But for a long time, we have existed in a kind of broadcast paradigm where there's a really straightforward funnel. You make some content, put it into the funnel, and it's going to like be sprayed on the audience whether they want it or not. And that is just not the reality now. So now we all have to work in this other way.
That sounds so scary. We all have to work, guys.
Yeah. But and I would just say, let me combine it to this other, like the ecosystem idea. What it kind of means is that all of those media that disappeared, all the magazines, they're happening in that, like TV shows and talk shows, all of that kind of creator content now. But at the same time, wait, like the same logic is also the shape of our businesses. And to think about that, like how do we engage with that? That's what we're going to have to relearn entirely, I think.
Yeah, but that would be my question to you, Johanna, because it, of course, is something that we observe en masse. It's like a polycrisis even, on so many levels. And it can be, and it is overwhelming for us, for our peers, for our networks. How do we start to approach this even? Not everybody has a backlog catalog of IP that can be turned into a theme parks,
No.
How does a producer approach this from where to begin even to kind of face this future?
I think, well, I mean, so this is the difficulty, and this is in a way why so much of the report this year is about this, because so many years, including last year, we've been saying, well, like the business model of each project has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. You have to understand what your project is. You have to understand who the audience is and where they can be reached and how they can be reached. And then you work backwards from that towards some kind of monetization model, which of course can be public funding. Then you have to fulfill some of those criteria. And of course, our problem with public funding, for instance, is that often the sort of funding criteria and the sort of audience success needs. Like those are sometimes in conflict with each other or entirely disconnected. So it's difficult to like also succeed because you're working towards very different sort of definitions of success. But I think, well, I mean, the sort of trivial answer to this is if you could just look at the documentarians, especially impact documentaries, they've been working like this for decades because they've had no alternatives. Everybody who hasn't really had like a big business, they have already been working like this. You have to understand what the project is. You have to understand where the audience is. And then they have been able to build all kinds of business models. And very often like centered on the human meeting, on the like touring screening, on these kind of Tupperware party type screenings where people like, buy a little mini license to host a screening in their home or all of these kinds of different models, which we've seen for a long time, which have been considered by the sort of heart of our industry to be very peripheral and very sort of irrelevant and cute. They have been, of course, pioneers of what we all kind of should have been thinking about the whole time. We've had the luxury, I think, in this kind of inside the broadcast paradigm, we've had the luxury of not having to think very much about the audience, of not earning the audience. We've been earning them in these indirect ways through speaking very beautifully at them. But we haven't been very interested in listening, and I don't think we still are.
What I find interesting in this year's report also that you focus very much on the audience and to also like it's an inspiration for me as a producer also to think more about this. I mean, this is also nothing new, but it goes more and more in that direction. And the report argues also that separating artistic and popular content is becoming less relevant today and highlights that the industry should think about how they measure success. And there's a funny quote from Peter Carlton I just want to bring you from your report. He says, "I do think we still suffer a little European snobbery. There are good and bad things about American culture, but it has less of a high culture, low culture divide. Nobody gives a shit, whereas here, with certain funding spheres and our own hierarchies, serious cinema, quote unquote serious, is ascribed certain qualities and value, whereas sci-fi and horror are considered lesser." So I think when you put that in your report, I think it also says something that we have to think more about the audience, because when you think more about the audience as a producer, it kind of is an incentive to reverse engineer to think about what kind of budget a certain project can afford, or what is my argument when I speak with distributors. How much budget can I ask for? Of course, that doesn't guarantee a hit, but is that your impression also that more responsibility goes back to the producers?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
When they budget their films?
Oh, absolutely. And this has also been, I mean, this has been the case. This should have been the case always. And it has very like practically been the case in the last, I mean, during the time I've been doing this, so over a decade now, one of the big changes is that that sort of traditional value chain has compressed, and the kind of operators in the middle, especially sales and distribution, have expanded up and down, like towards also owning cinemas or streamers, or towards also like being in on the script level, investing very early, like sales companies developing projects, distributors becoming studios, all of this stuff, which now is completely normalized, but was quite strange even just 10 years ago. But what it means when we say that every project's business model, and again, we wrote about this last year, that you have to kind of design the project's business model together with its artistic project. You can't separate those two from each other, and you have to do that project by project. But what I felt was like so unfair, and I even felt it last year when we wrote that whole chapter. That's a huge thing to ask. That is a terribly big thing to ask. And a lot of people who are in this business, I think a lot of people who are in culture in general, including myself, I used to have a production company making public service content. We're not interested in business at all. The only reason we have a business is that you have to have a business for like legal and practical logistical reasons. It's a way to interface with society. We could care less about a business plan. In fact, I do meet people who have quite successful production companies on the smaller side who don't have a business plan. They are not profitable a lot of the time, and they just keep somehow, like they're just bumblebees that just keep flying. And I think that that's the human cost of that is terrible, and like the health costs of that are terrible. But like fundamentally, like a lot of people in our business are just not, we are not like, as I think it was Ted Hope who said last year, like we need authors of business, and we don't have a lot of authors of business here. Now in the United States, they do have authors of business because they have to. There are people there who can be great producers of independent cinema, but who are also just like thrilled by Excel sheets and funding like little figuring out some funding harebrained plan and like being ahead of the curve. And I maybe think we haven't celebrated those aspects so much here in Europe. We haven't said, and also because you can't make that much money. Like I think if you're that kind of a person in Europe, maybe you would end up in another business historically, because we don't make that many people like individually rich here either.
Yeah, but do you think it's, I mean, of course you're saying jokingly it's about the love of and the thrill of Excel sheets, but maybe it's also about this entrepreneurial thing, entrepreneurial vibe. And I think it goes to the quote that Fabian just cited, that there is a certain snobbery in the film industry or audiovisual industry in Europe.
That's Peter Carlton's quote.
That's Peter Carlton's quote. And I should say, Peter Carlton is is a co-founder of Warp Films, which is the company that gave us Adolescence and This Is England. Like they make especially, I mean, film and television, like they make quite niche, regional dialect heavy, often kitchen sink style content. Like they're a very serious, and also quite political company, like who are have a very strong like non-London identity. But that doesn't stop him from like understanding that these commercial things. I think he also says in another quote in the report, it says something like a black metal fan in Cape Town has more in common with a black metal fan in Norway than a country and Western fan in Ireland or whatever it was. And like there's that thing about the popular as well. So that's kind of the other side of this, is that like I think in the US, the reason they've had this acceptance or like they've just been better at making like artistically qualitative film that has audience appeal because they had to. Like when you don't have soft money, you have to be able to reach an audience or you're not going to be in business. And that's in a way, that's a harder game to play. Now, in Europe, I'm so grateful and proud that we have been able to fund artistic experimentation and niche things. But the balance that always risks tipping over and arguably has many times in many of our countries, like it tips over towards this kind of elitism because your de facto audience isn't the real audience in the end. Your de facto audience becomes the funders and the programmers of the A festivals. So that it's the taste of maybe 1,000 people in Europe determines 70% of our films or something like that.
So that's a bubble, basically. It's really a bubble.
Of course it's a bubble. Or it's a subculture. It's a fandom, you know. It's this like nerdy fandom of people who have a certain kind of aesthetic. James Schamus, who also the screenwriter, and he used to be CEO of Focus Features, who is also in the report, he says, you know, like this kind of work tends to, like the kind of work he loves, the kind of work I think most of us love, the kind of film like that we love, it tends to work like veer towards this kind of these aesthetic norms that are not very wide. They can look very different and feel very different because that is our aesthetic, but actually many kinds of genres and many kinds of storytelling approaches are not considered suitable or appropriate in our kind of film. And this is where I think it gets so damn exciting because, and this is so typical, and this is why like the report is also called Challenging Projections, because projections, of course, like film projection, right? Map projections, but also psychological projection, you know, like you project your own emotions onto people around you or things that are happening so you don't see what's actually happening. So often in this industry, we are disagreeing with ourselves. Like we have these incredibly confident norms and convictions. Oh, it's like this, or this is good, or this is bad. And then we will, in the next breath, we will celebrate something that is not at all like that. But it's, but that's like, you know, I don't know. All of the things that are trash. Like we know what trash looks like. Musicals, you know, except when that musical is made by an art house filmmaker and it's in Cannes. Or when the genre, like the explosive, high-paced genre, thrilling thing, splatter, whatever it is, when that's competing in Cannes, well, it doesn't count because that's like an art film. That's made by people who are like one of us. Okay, now how do you become one of us? After we finished the report, I'm like, I should have named these things. Okay, now I have named them. Outsider paradox. One is, oh, but these people aren't in the industry. They're just creators, or they're just like these DIY filmmakers, or whatever it is, you know, depending on which decade you're in. But when they succeed, oh, but this person was inherently an artist. They were one of us all along. Then you can never be an outsider. When you succeed, you're already one of us. And the same thing is happening, of course, with the mainstream genres. You know, like, and I think this is why we don't like to talk about Christopher Nolan, because we don't know what to do with his work. Is it mainstream? How can he make blockbusters? How can they be blockbusters? Is what, you know, you think about Oppenheimer. How the hell is that film a blockbuster? So we can't deal with it, so we just deny its existence somehow. But I think it's true. Like a lot of films, it's, all of this is trash. Again, unless it's one of us or somebody, who makes a mainstream film that's so good that it can compete in our competitions and all of that stuff, or has a European sensibility. Then it's not like that. It doesn't have that quality. It's not melodramatic. It's Todd Haynes.
I was just wondering, maybe I'm French and I'm going to be the devil advocate of cultural exception, but I also did thesis on American indie cinema. And if I quote Peter Carlton, he says things that are static tend to break. And I completely understand him. And I also have been advocating for more business mindset in my own country. But what if we keep providing the audience what they want and always what they want? I mean, indie cinema has always been, queer cinema has always been bringing what people don't expect. And so I'm annoyed with all that terminology. I completely understand we need to have an audience, and I sometimes explain producer what is a target audience and how they can define the target audience to get more audience. But when I'm annoyed, and this morning I was in an industry event and all my industry were like so overwhelmed about this creator economy, and I was just talking to Fabian about how they describe these guys that are so clever to manage to monetize potato chips out of their creativity. And I'm like, well, it's merchandising. I have...
Exactly. We've done all of these elements. Nothing about that is new. Nothing about it is new.
Nothing is new. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's my...
the thing that is new, and we could talk about that separately, because all of these films that are mentioned now in the same breath, they're all very different. But certainly, Obsession and Backrooms are the most traditional kinds of... Obsession is a film festival no? It's a low budget. I was around in the 90s. I work in film now because I watched all of those 90s films in film festivals in Helsinki. I listened to Kevin Smith's podcasts for he celebrates 20 years in podcasting now. He's an indie filmmaker who is a creator who made his breakthrough film for $5,000 on credit cards and all that stuff. None of this is new. He's been forwarding and touring nobody knows again, people with good taste don't know that he's still working because his films don't show up in the kind of places where we go. You have to be very committed to see Yoga Hosers or Tusk, to mention some films that you absolutely don't need to look up at all. But I love his stuff. Okay, so that was a little bit side note. No, Obsession is like that. And Backrooms, of course, is a studio film. Essentially, it's a young filmmaker who established himself online, through a short film, essentially, but that short film would have been distributed in some other way 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I think maybe what is different, so in that case, what is different is that person who creates that breakthrough short film can be anywhere. Short films have a way of going viral, which, let's be real, they have not historically. And that person can continue to create content, essentially have a TV show of their own, which they haven't been able to do. And they will work very, very closely with their audience and really hone their craft in relationship to audience reactions in a way that you can't do that on traditional short films. The cycles are too short, or the distance to the audience is too long. You will meet them too rarely. So that part is different. But the business side, none of that is particularly new. And it's really been annoying me that some of these industry podcasts, people that I really respect, The Town, they were I think Matt Belloni on The Town was but Shelby Oaks, that wasn't a huge hit. That did 6 million at the box office. I can't remember the number. Yeah, but that film was crowdfunded. He owned it, the creator owned it. The film director owned it outright. That film was owned and paid for before it hit the cinemas. And then if you make, again, I can't remember now which distribution it has, so I don't know what cut he got, but let's say the couple of million that he probably netted from that to invest in his company in his next film, that's an outstanding success for a debut filmmaker. That's fantastic. Another whole theme in the report is we can't, all of these metrics mean different things. You can't look at a box office number and use it for anything. But I have to say, I turned the Frenchness back on you and say, I think also maybe you have this French reaction to this because you are French and you guys have an audience. The French film industry makes very successful commercial films for French audiences and for the world. Thank you very much. You're very good at making adventure blockbuster films that travel internationally. They should travel better, I believe, than they do. But it's not that the films are bad. You have produced filmmakers, commercial filmmakers who work in Europe and in Hollywood, a bunch of them. Again, they don't win a lot of our awards, but they're there. And you have produced some companies and studio structures that are working very successfully in this sort of global marketplace. We don't always count it because these kinds of non-US like commercial storytelling companies don't always succeed in the US market. So they don't get to that kind of mainstream visibility. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a good business or that the films aren't great action films, for instance. Of course, you're very good at it. I live in Sweden and we cannot get our local audiences to show up for Swedish films in any genre right now. And then we have to say then there is a difference. So it might be a kind of French bias to say because you do have commercial success.
Yes, but because we also have a system that protects our industry. And that was my question. We have a system that protects us and that prevents us from always providing to an audience or to consumer. That's what the cultural exception is. So,
but it also projects you from the dominance of the U.S. imports.
Yeah, but it's the same idea. Is the idea is to give the means to people to create, even if the audience is not expecting this to have.
Oh, absolutely. But it's also because in Sweden we make a ton. All of the European countries now make a ton of movies, especially compared to 20 years ago. But we make we are not largely in Europe. We are not very good at making the kinds of movies that actually reach audiences or that have a popular approach. And I would say that France is great at that. So it's a combination of being able to make the unexpected, but also of having an infrastructure. You have so many cinemas. Your system has been optimized for creating the best circumstances for your commercial and for your very surprising film. But then also, in addition to that, I also want to say, of course, my whole argument about the popular is that we can't make a distinction between quality and surprise on one hand and commercial and popular reach on the other, because that's just not true. That is not true. That is some kind of blind spot that is caused by our own elitist taste.
Yeah, in the report, you're also mentioning the concept of different success metrics. We also have discussed it here, and we have discussed it in the industry. I know that we don't have that much time, but going towards the end, I would like to ask you about this feeling I have, or a notion I have, that we are in the industry in Europe either looking for solutions to protect what we have, and we are very kind of protective and we are very afraid and scared, or we are trying to build on something that's actually not even that new, but it gives this promise of, we reinvent something from the scratch. So how does this dilemma sort of play out in the report, but also in your perspective on the next few years?
Yeah, acting from fear is never very good to begin with. And I think that thinking from fear is also not very good. And many of the reactions in the last few weeks to these creator films and their successes are panicked and weird. And one of the weird things is that it's sometimes it feels to me like they are not aware of these 10 other creator films that have been in cinemas in the US and Europe in the last year. They were paying attention, so you're grabbing onto a headline and you're reacting to the headline rather than even Googling or even figuring out what's actually going on. And then there are going to be people are drawing some conclusions based on headlines, it seems. And I would assume that those conclusions aren't going to be great. So that's just not going to lead anywhere very good. But if a lot of people do things in a panic, some will accidentally stumble upon successful formulas. And then we will look at that and they will say, oh, okay, that's what we should all be doing. And then we run in that direction. More hockey, romance, whatever. I think I was on a panel at Serienkamp in Cologne, and Alex Traila was on the panel, and he just everything he said was wonderful. He spoke so beautifully from this sort of Council of Europe perspective. But he said that I'm listening to you all speak, and you're using, especially I was using the word defend and protect so much. He says that he doesn't feel that that's a good starting point for art. Anything? Damn it, he's right. Yeah, he's completely right, of course. So I don't think we should think so much about defending and protecting. I mean, yes, democracy, for instance, yes. But it's not like this kind of defensive and shutting things, like the enclosed approach is probably not very productive. I think that the question is like, what can we build? Like what do we know to be real? And like how can we, instead of saying like how can we like protect from disinformation, maybe we say like how do we build truth and joy? How do we create things that are meaningful? And then we have to go back to like, of course, the artistic heart, but it's also like you have to be at like in conversation with an audience, and you have to be really listening to what people need and what they love. So I think kind of there's some answer there. And again, if you do it on a very small scale, like small creator building a following, or like you have, again, a documentary filmmaker, or like a starting filmmaker making films for his local community, her local community, all of this stuff. Or you can do it on this very large scale with like it's doing something very popularly appealing but of an enormous high quality. Those are kind of the easiest ways. It's the middle that's difficult.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you say, that like out of defending is not a good starting point. There's more what we can build, but the public funds and institutions in Europe, of course, play a role, because the market power of American or Chinese players is so big. Otherwise, they would just sweep the market here. So we all know that the public funds' existence is based on the protection, basically. But I wish actually, since you put all this together in the report, and these exciting new things are happening, which are maybe not entirely new, but they are coming, new impulses, new low budget forms, more thinking about audience. And I would love that your report is being read also by more of the institutions to provide the ground of being more flexible. And I wanted to ask you that because you have some partners there, right? The Netherlands Film Fund, the Moyne Film Fund is there. And what's happening with the report right now? Are you going basically on tour or all over Europe to speak with funders?
Usually what I would do, like what I would have done before the pandemic, I had like 200 travel days a year or something like that. Then I was out speaking a lot. And it is read actually at a lot of the funds. I'm happy and surprised to hear. But of course, many of the funds they're regulated in law. And we, for very good reasons, we don't want laws to be fast and easy to change. And even other kinds of regulation can be quite difficult to change. Unfortunately, we have also seen in many countries, these are not protected and you can turn off the money taps over. And that's going to be happening more often, I think. Ultimately, the trend is that we're going to have less of this money. So even if it was just for that reason, we have to start to think about how would we operate if we didn't have this money? Because again, like wars may be coming. And even if they're not coming, the defense industry is certainly revving up, and the climate crisis will not diminish. And we are in right now still with the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. Like we have not calculated in as a society what kind of absolutely dark years we might have ahead of us. And and in a way, it's good to not think about it since we can't affect it. But this we might be going to a very, very bad place, and then that money may be needed for very good reasons for other purposes. That said, now we have it, and I think we should be using it to build up these resilient things. And what the institutions can definitely do is that they can create structures that can help us experiment. I haven't thought very deeply about this, but like my gut instinct based on the last few years is like, yeah, slate investment is better. Let's do slate investment to have, spread the risk a little bit, but to be able to build infrastructure. I think, I was saying in the report, I don't see why, like we make blockbusters for other people with other people's money. Why do we need to be able to develop and identify the people in Europe who can write and direct commercial films? And what are the capital structures that we need to construct to be able to make an expensive film? This is like a studio type film in Norway or in France or in some, for the global market. Of course we can do that. We're doing it for everybody else. They might taste different, but the quality could be the same and the popular appeal could be the same. Nobody's paying for development. Right now, nobody can afford to pay for development. Okay, great. Let's put public money into development. Let's do it in ways where when we are testing new ways of funding and distributing, we have to have some kind of way. You have to force that knowledge back into the system. You can't sit and hoard it. Like there are pretty obvious things that we can do that don't even have to be very expensive. I would also think that if there were people from funds here, they would say many of us have those kind of experimental funds. People don't use them. They don't know how to use them. So this is like the producers, unfortunately, also have to kind of take the lead there. And maybe let's not be like so freaked out by private money and like brand partnerships if it's value aligned, I don't see why we wouldn't take money.
Yeah, we had the discussion here also about brand partnerships. And my company, we produced a film with a brand. It's like even 8 years ago, and it was one of the most freedom we had to do the project the way we wanted. But the deal was good.
And that's not uncommon, I don't think. Like, I think that's how brands do want to work now. So that's the way. So like every time, and even if it's just like part of, because everybody has to think in slates, right? How much risk can I take? Yeah, you'd make like your safe project, and then you do your brand experiment project, and then you do like your, I don't know, maybe you do like a small film with soft money that has like a high popularity and wide appeal. But then you maximize that soft money and keep as much ownership as you possibly can to see if you can make some money out of it, to build some buffer, to be able to like to build. In the end, I think we do have to be at least that much business that we have to be able to retain enough ownership. I always align myself with the producers. It's very weird. Like
we do too.
I know you guys do. I should be standing with the audience. But I think, like, I just think that we can't make like humanly sustainable workplaces, and we can't have a sustainable artistic industry, if we don't have like a reasonable economics in it. But I also say in the report that some film maybe shouldn't be part of that, even that industry. Like maybe some of it should just be like completely like art. Let's separate the most artistic, like the most experimental things that we know is not going to have an audience. Great. Let's put it there and make it in an arts contest.
I think that's a perfect line to wrap it up, really. I think, do we have any other questions, Johanna?
I have one thing that I have to say, because I have a new like hobby horse. We already talked about this last year, but I've been thinking about it all year and I cannot let it go. You guys, everybody who has a platform, everybody who's listening who has a platform, especially if you're at a festival, especially if you're a funder, we have to be able to collate the festival screening numbers. We were talking about this in last year's report, that even, for some films, even the premiere, even just the one like screening at an A festival, those 3,000, 4,000 people in the premiere screening may be more than the admissions in a co-production country, or sometimes even in the home country. We cannot evaluate the success of our artistic film if we don't measure the goddamn numbers of the festivals. If a film goes to 100 festivals, not all of those screenings are going to be sold out, but some are. It's insane that we don't have these numbers, and we can't talk about cultural value and cultural impact. We cannot protect our public funding if we don't have these numbers. It's crazy. And besides, if we have, like, you can do more things with the data. If you end up in that country, if you do get a traditional release, it's kind of useful to know. Maybe you would happen to know like who showed up. What did they say online? Like, what age are they? Wouldn't that be great data to have when you have already screened? Send a spy from the festival into each screening and like clock the laughs. I mean, there are so many things we could do with festivals to create like incredibly rich data. And right now we don't even have admissions numbers. That's mad. This is a totally solvable problem.
I think what also comes not only from this report, but from previous reports and from knowing you and your work and your expertise, knowledge is power, data is power. And if you don't gather data, you are only left to guess. And guessing is only 50% chances. You can be right, you can be wrong, you can be somewhere completely off. And all of us here, we support the idea of actually gathering data and being smart about what are the metrics of success that we apply and that we have to kind of be measured against.
In the report that Ina Ignatiev-Lemke also says, which I think is also wise, like, well, you can't only look at like data. You can't only rely on some algorithm, because then you're also always looking backwards and not forwards. And that is also true. But I don't think that the correct answer is to do what we've been doing so far, is to just like either ignore the data entirely or just like pick and choose to prove some point that we have already convinced ourselves of. I think we can do a little bit better there. There's a middle road.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Johanna, for taking the time and speaking with us. And I can recommend to everybody to read the report. We're going to link it in the show notes, of course. And I really hope that many funders and festivals read the report as well, because we need more room to experiment also, like you said, and more flexibility. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that's it for today. Thanks to our guest Johanna Koljonen and to my co-hosts Joanna Szymanska and Jennifer Saba-Imagine. Make sure you follow our community on LinkedIn. That's simply the side letters. And see you next Wednesday when we will be back with B2B insights on the creative industries in Europe.